I'm here at the Federal Judicial Center with Marlene Trestman, a former special assistant to the Maryland Attorney General, who's written a biography of Bessie Margolin titled Fair Labor Lawyer, The Remarkable Life of New Deal Attorney and Supreme Court Advocate Bessie Margolin. Marlene was the winner of the Hughes Gossett Award in 2012 for Best Article Published in the Journal of Supreme Court History for an advance excerpt from this book. Both Marlene and her subject are from New Orleans, and Fair Labor Lawyer was published this spring by Louisiana State University Press. Good morning, Marlene.
Good morning, Claire.
First off, I think most of our viewers have never heard of Bessie Margolin. Can you give a quick explanation of who she was and why we should care about her?
Absolutely. She may be the most influential lawyer of the 20th century no one's heard of. Before there was Justice O'Connor, and certainly before the notorious RBG, as she's affectionately known, there was an audacious Bessie Margolin. And she left her mark on some of the biggest issues of her day. She started in the 30s as one of the nation's rare women lawyers, and went on to change history.
Explain a bit about your relationship with Bessie Margolin.
Happy to. As you said, Bessie Margolin was raised in New Orleans in a Jewish orphanage, and there she learned principles of social justice that shaped her life. In 1946, the orphanage closed. Bessie was well on her way. I was orphaned 2 decades later, but the agency had transformed into a social service agency that took my custody. I was given an education at the Isidore Newman School where Bessie went, and because of that, we were introduced to each other, and I got to know her during my years in college, law school, and into my legal career. So she was part friend, part mentor, and certainly inspiration.
Why did you decide to undertake writing her biography?
As I progressed in my legal career and really understood what a legend she was, I was struck that no one had ever undertaken to write her biography. So I started, and you may well remember, Claire, that I sought places that I thought would honor her. I wrote to or called the Supreme Court Historical Society and was certainly welcomed, but asked to write about her myself, which as a practicing lawyer and mother of 2 small children was a tall order. I nominated her to other organizations, hoping to get a source that would write about her to no avail. So finally, I decided that it was on me to do it.
And you took a leave from your job in the Maryland Attorney General's office to write the book. Tell me about that.
Yes. Once I finally decided that I was going to write something, to say I was going to write a book was a little daunting. But it was around 2005 that I acquired her papers, started doing interviews on my own time, and little by little was into the process. When I knew it was serious, this is now 2011 or so, I started applying for grants to give me institutional imprimatur to undertake this, published my article in the Journal of Supreme Court History, and then decided there was enough there to ask for leave from the Attorney General's office, which I took. And then once I got the publishing contract, I was trying to do both jobs at the same time, write the book and be a special assistant. That didn't work, so I ended up retiring in July of 2013 to finish the book, for which I'd already gotten a publishing contract from LSU Press.
Let's talk about Margolin's life. Tell me about her education.
Her education really begins, as I mentioned before, in the Jewish orphanage, where she was schooled not only in rigorous college preparatory academics, but also in the values of Reform Judaism, which preached social justice. Mm-hmm. That sort of launched her in that, and at no time in that early education did she find any insurmountable obstacles to pursuing excellence in academia. She won the scholarship to Newcomb, transferred to Tulane, and audaciously declared she wanted to go to law school, the first girl from the orphanage ever to do that. Ended up graduating from Tulane, second in her class, Tulane Law School, the only woman in her class and second in the class, and then went on to get her doctorate in law at Yale after she had completed her law degree at Tulane, and she was the first woman awarded Yale's Sterling Fellowship to pursue doctorate studies in law.
And at Yale Law School, she met William O. Douglas, the future Supreme Court Justice. What was their relationship like?
She did. She had started off as a research assistant because the dean of the law school did not want to encourage a woman to pursue a job teaching law that simply didn't exist. But while she was there, she impressed not only the professor for whom she was a research assistant, but William O. Douglas, who ended up becoming her primary thesis advisor on the thesis that she wrote in bankruptcy and reorganization. Their relationship was quite close in a mentor and mentee sense, and I was struck by the fact that Bessie, who had started in comparative law and conflicts, must have also made an impression on Douglas because he published an article during her time there in the Law Review that examined some of his issues from an international perspective, and he had not done that before.
Let's talk a bit about her early career. She worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority. Explain her work, what she did for them.
She was the first woman attorney hired by the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it was on the recommendation of her law professors, including Justice Douglas. And there she was a lawyer who watched a brand new federal agency come into existence, and not only watched it, but learned how a federal agency takes shape. She was there as challenges came up over every aspect of the agency, and most importantly, the beginnings of what became the constitutional challenges at the Supreme Court that manifested in the Ashwander and Tennessee Electric Power Company cases. So she really cut her teeth as a new lawyer, watching some of the most skillful advocates of her time, including John Lord O'Brien, worked with some of the real dream team of the New Deal, the legal dream team of the New Deal, in seeing cases go from the trial court up through including the Supreme Court.
And she was invited to go to Nuremberg for the Nuremberg Trials. What was her role there, and did she meet Justice Robert Jackson?
She had already met Justice Jackson during her arguments that she had already become a Supreme Court advocate for the Department of Labor, and she had argued before Justice Jackson several times before he became the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at the International Military Tribunals. When it was first announced that he was going to step down from the bench to pursue this historic path, she was among the first to write him and ask that she could join his team. He declined, saying that he had to put together a team very quickly, couldn't take her, but she clearly already had her appetite whet. When it was time for the subsequent proceedings, the more than 200 trials of second-tier Nazis that came after the International Military Tribunal, Bessie was tasked to draft the rules that established those trials. So she was actually in Nuremberg in the courtroom as Justice Jackson delivered the closing arguments for his trial. She was even there at the parties that were held by Justice Jackson after the conclusion of those. And then she stayed on to oversee and to draft the rules that became the format for those subsequent proceedings.
But she spent most of her career at the Department of Labor.
That's correct.
And she litigated cases involving the Fair Labor Standards Act. What was that act exactly, and why was it the subject of so much litigation?
When Bessie left the TVA and was drawn to another grand piece of social legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which for the first time invoked Federal Commerce Clause powers to establish a federal minimum wage and require overtime for hours worked beyond that, and also to outlaw oppressive child labor. The reason that Bessie was fortunate to have such a slate of cases that were going to the Supreme Court or could go is because Congress did not impose within the Fair Labor Standards Act an administrative review process for the bulk of its cases. So all of the terms of the law were subject to dispute, and much to Justice Frankfurter's chagrin, which he often directed at Bessie Margolin, Congress had not settled many of the issues it left to the court to interpret.
The wrath of Felix Frankfurter.
Yes,
Don't envy her.
She withstood it quite well with both grace and humor, something not often done at the Supreme Court.
Many times said to me that the court should, these are questions for Congress and not for the court. But after all, Congress has 400 or 500 people that they have to get into agreement on language. And the court has just 9. And which is enough.
How many cases did she argue before the Supreme Court?
It seems like such an easy question. It was actually, I'll answer in terms of arguments. Okay. She argued 24 times at the Supreme Court in what were 27 separately docketed cases. She prevailed in the cases for 21 of the 24 arguments.
So you've taken a lot of time to do definitive research about which women have argued the most cases before the Supreme Court in order to put Margolin's accomplishments in context. What were some of the challenges in doing that research, and what were your findings?
I guess some of the challenges of doing the research were that I couldn't just go to a book and find the answer in the first place. And there was no list. There was no definitive list, which was surprising to me because in order to find out that Bessie was the 25th woman ever to argue at the Supreme Court, I had to find all of the others before her. So it literally was a tedious, but I'm notoriously stubborn, task of perusing the journal of the Supreme Court to find, which I used as the authoritative basis for who argued on which days, and chronicle who had argued when. But it also led me down several paths of research I hadn't expected, and that allowed me to figure out how many arguments each of those women had argued, including figuring out that who were the top women advocates of the entire 20th century.
And so can you just name the top 3? Mabel Willebrandt?
That's right. Mabel Walker Willebrandt with 29 arguments. Next is B. Rosenberg, Bessie's contemporary, with 28 arguments. Then comes Bessie at 24, and Helen Carlos at 21.
And these women were all unsung government lawyers who devoted their lives to litigation. How are they similar and how are they different?
Well, unsung is interesting because they're unsung largely today, although Mabel Walker Willebrandt, of course, has had a little more fame. And at her time, she was one of the most famous women in America. Her picture was on the cover of Time. I think all of them, especially as I know more about Bessie Margolin, faced the reality that they were rarities. And it was great when they were lauded, but no doubt they were the subject of perhaps on good days amusement and on other days disparagement. And there's lots of recordings about that. Women had to worry about some of the things that were already resolved for men, from what to wear and how to present themselves in a way that brought dignity to the case, but not to be accused, as we're now familiar with, playing the woman card in a way that would demean or undermine the case.
Do you think that Margolin considered herself a feminist?
For a woman who was such a wordsmith, I'm surprised at her disdain for the word, but I think that was something of women of her era. And she lived basically throughout the 20th century. She was, absolutely. For someone who wanted and let nothing stand in her way to be a lawyer, to be the best lawyer she could be, to make her way into the elite circles of Supreme Court advocacy, that's the height of feminism. But it wasn't a subject she spoke much about until she became responsible for the Equal Pay Act's enforcement. And she was quoted by a newspaper reporter as saying, I've never been a feminist, but I'm becoming one. And that was in the late 1960s. She was. By anyone's standards, she was.
What was her biggest triumph in terms of her cases she argued before the Supreme Court? What was sort of the pinnacle of her career?
It's an interesting question in the sense that each of her cases were really building blocks. They were stepping stones in the creation of the body of law that now gives life to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the triumph, the big triumph really was that she became the encyclopedic master of the Supreme Court litigation involving the Fair Labor Standards Act. Her cases ran the gamut from terms involving coverage, which employees were covered, which employers or employees were exempt, but she was also very proud of the cases that enhanced the enforcement tools and the mechanisms for injunction and back pay. But her biggest triumph, if asked, of her career is the case that was declined for review by the Supreme Court, and that would have been her Equal Pay Act case in Wheaton, Schultz v. Wheaton Glass, a case in which it was established that the Equal Pay Act requires only that jobs be substantially equal and not identical.
And what year was that?
The decline, the denial of the petition for cert was in 1969.
69. And when did she retire?
She retired in 1972, and the case was so contentious that the final battle and the final award granting relief to the women at the Wheaton Glass factory came down 10 days before her retirement in January 1972.
And she had quite a retirement party, I understand.
She did. From what I hear, there had never been one like it before or after for a federal career employee as Margolin. Some 200 people assembled in the Washington Hilton at the invitation of the labor solicitor to salute Margolin's 4-decade career in federal employment. And to honor Margolin, Chief Justice Earl Warren, then retired, was guest speaker and lauded her by crediting her with putting the flesh and sinews on the bones of the Fair Labor Standards Act, bones that he said would have been wholly inadequate without the implementation she forged in the courtrooms of our land.
That in the 33 years of litigation representing the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Labor Department, and implementing the Fair Labor Standards Act, she didn't always have a bed of roses. I am sure the hundreds of briefs that she wrote and the scores of cases she argued, some in every one of the 11 circuits and 27 in the Supreme Court, must have raised enough hackles in some quarters to have made her look forward to the serenity of retirement. The 27 cases alone that she argued in the Supreme Court was a prodigious undertaking. The Fair Labor Standards Act was not always popular in all quarters, and the flesh and sinews that were developed around its bare bones were her great contribution to millions of American working people.
Use those exact words,
those
flesh
words.
And sinews on the bones. That's lovely.
That's correct.
So Margolin never married.
That's correct.
What can you tell us about her personal life?
She realized fairly early that marriage was not in the cards for a woman who wanted to pursue law as a full career. She even wrote about it in 1938 in a sorority magazine, lamenting that women not only needed to excel, they needed to have far better equipment in order to get the jobs that men would get. But she was quite social. She had a very strong circle of friends, some of whom went back to her days at the New Deal. But she was also not all work and no play. Some of her, I guess, her penchant for passion may have, it certainly got her entangled in an affair that was the subject of federal investigation and may have cost her the federal judgeship she coveted.
Oh, that's tantalizing. My last question to you is, did your relationship with Margolin affect your writing? Did it make it more difficult to be impartial, or did it help you to give you some personal insight into her character, having known her?
I knew that I had to be careful not to have the biography turn into hagiography. But as I learned more about her from interviews, from archival resources, from the few papers she left, there were enough crumbs to make the full picture. As I say in the book, she was not a perfect orator. There were lots of things in her life that certainly I think I was fair in calling them as they were. But on the other hand, having known her, I was able to at least put my own personal evaluation on other information I had, but being careful never to have it overshadow the evidence as I found it.
Marlene, thank you so much for talking with me today, and thank you for giving Bessie Margolin her due with this wonderful biography.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for all the help and support you've given to me.